Welcome to TopSpot40 Music Docuseries, where we bring the stories behind the music to life.
It was Sunday night in America, and for 23 remarkable years, that meant one thing. Families would finish dinner, the dishes would be cleared, and everyone would gather around the television set as the familiar voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Ed Sullivan Show." There, stepping onto the stage with that slightly formal posture and those warm, knowing eyes, stood a man who looked more like your favorite uncle than a television star. He wasn't flashy, he didn't sing, he couldn't dance. But Ed Sullivan possessed something far more valuable. He had an instinct for what people needed to see and hear, often before they knew it themselves. Born in 1901, Sullivan came up in the newspaper business, writing a widely read column for the New York Daily News. He loved show business with a passion that never left him. Vaudeville, Broadway, the big bands, he knew every performer, every backstage story, every rising talent. When television came calling in 1948, the network took a chance on this ink-stained columnist with the gravelly voice and awkward stage presence. What they got was a television miracle. From the very beginning, Toast of the Town, later renamed The Ed Sullivan Show, felt different. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a window onto the entire world of American culture, presented with dignity and genuine respect. Opera singers followed plate spinners, ballet dancers shared the stage with stand-up comedians. And then in the mid-1950s, something seismic began to happen. A new sound started rumbling out of the South and the inner cities, a sound that made parents nervous and teenagers feel alive. Rock and roll. Ed Sullivan didn't set out to become the man who brought rock and roll into American living rooms, but that's exactly what he became. The turning point came in 1956. A young truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi named Elvis Presley had already caused a sensation with his recordings and live appearances. But many television hosts refused to book him, fearing the controversy that followed his every hip-shaking move. Sullivan, ever the newspaper man with his finger on the pulse of popular culture, saw something deeper. He saw a phenomenon that couldn't be ignored. When Elvis finally appeared on September 9, 1956, the results were extraordinary. More than 60 million people tuned in, roughly 80% of the television audience that night. Sullivan, sensing the moment, gave the performance the respect of a major cultural event. He introduced Elvis not as a threat to decency, but as an exciting new voice in American music. The camera may have stayed carefully above the waist during that first appearance, but the music reached every corner of the country. Young people saw their music validated on the most respected variety show in America. Parents saw that the world wasn't ending after all. And Ed Sullivan, in his quiet way, had just helped legitimize rock and roll. But Sullivan's greatest gift wasn't just booking the big names, it was his willingness to keep evolving, to keep listening. When a British band arrived in America in February 1964, just weeks after the nation had buried a beloved president, Sullivan once again understood what the country needed: joy, excitement, something to lift the national spirit. On February 9, 1964, the Beatles made their American television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. The screams from the studio audience were so loud that the band could barely hear themselves play. 73 million Americans watched, a record that would stand for decades. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, with their mop-top haircuts and infectious energy, didn't just perform that night. They announced the arrival of a new generation. And once again, it was Ed Sullivan who opened the door and welcomed them in with that famous introduction, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles." What followed became known as the British Invasion, and Sullivan was there for all of it. The Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five, Petula Clark. He gave them all a platform, treating each act with the same professional respect he gave to opera stars and Broadway legends. To Sullivan, talent was talent. Good music was good music. He also understood the power of television to break down barriers. In an era when many parts of the country were still segregated, Sullivan regularly featured black artists as headliners. James Brown, the Supremes, the Temptations, Stevie Wonder, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, and a young Jackson 5 all received the full Ed Sullivan treatment. When Sam Cooke appeared, or when Marvin Gaye sang How Sweet It Is, millions of white Americans saw black performers not as novelties, but as brilliant artists worthy of the Sullivan stage. That mattered. It mattered deeply. Of course, it wasn't always smooth. There were famous moments of tension. When The Doors appeared in 1967, Sullivan's producers asked them to change the lyric, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," in Light My Fire. The band agreed, then defiantly sang the original line anyway. Sullivan was furious. He refused to shake their hands and reportedly banned them from the show. Yet, even in disagreement, there was a kind of integrity to it all. Ed Sullivan ran his show like a gentleman ran his home. He had standards, but he also had the courage to keep inviting the future onto his stage. Through the turbulent 60s, as America changed and music grew louder and more rebellious, Sullivan remained a steady presence. He booked Jimi Hendrix. He introduced The Who to American audiences. He gave the Jefferson Airplane a national platform. And always, between the rock acts, you'd find the Italian mouse puppet Topo Gigio or a troupe of acrobats from Budapest. That was the beautiful contradiction of the show. One minute you'd be tapping your foot to the Young Rascals singing Good Lovin', and the next you'd be watching a man balance spinning plates while Sullivan stood in the wings, smiling like a proud father. What made Sullivan so effective was that he never pretended to be hip. He was a man of his generation, born at the beginning of the 20th century, who simply loved excellence and recognized authenticity when he saw it. Young musicians respected him for that. They knew that if Ed Sullivan liked what you were doing, millions of American families would hear it too. By the time the show ended in 1971, a revolution had taken place. Rock and roll had gone from being dismissed as a passing fad to becoming the dominant cultural force of the age. And the man who had done more than anyone to make that transition possible was the same unassuming fellow who used to say with that wonderful New York accent, "We've got a really big shoe for you tonight." Ed Sullivan passed away in 1974, but his influence never really left us. Every time you see a late-night host introduce a new band, every time a young artist gets their big break on television, you're seeing the echo of what Sullivan created. He proved that popular music could be presented with dignity. That rock and roll belonged in the American living room right alongside Broadway show tunes and classical music. That teenagers and their grandparents could, for 1 hour every Sunday night, share the same cultural experience. In the end, Ed Sullivan didn't just introduce America to rock and roll, he introduced rock and roll to America's parents. He showed a divided nation that music could be a bridge rather than a battleground. And he did it with class, with integrity, and with an open heart. So the next time you hear All You Need Is Love or Hound Dog or I Want to Hold Your Hand, take a moment to remember the man who brought those songs into our homes. The man who stood on that simple stage week after week and quietly changed the world one Sunday night at a time. He really did have a really big show, and we were lucky enough to have been there for it.
Thank you for joining us for TopSpot40 Music docuseries. Discover all the stories behind the music at TopSpot40.com. Until next time, keep the music playing.